"You're crying again," he said. The widow smiled. "Then hold me until I stop." The wind carried the sound long before he reached the ridge, a soft, breaking sob that didn't belong to the quiet of the Wyoming plains. And as the last streaks of dusk stretched across the sky like fading embers, the widow sat alone on a fallen cottonwood log, her black shawl trembling around her shoulders as though it too felt the weight she carried, her face hidden in her hands, while tears slipped through her fingers and fell onto the dust at her feet. She had ridden out here to escape the polite condolences of town, to escape the pity, to escape the suffocating silence of a house that still smelled like a man who would never come home again. And now, with only the cool breath of evening around her, she let herself break the way she never allowed in front of anyone, her chest heaving as though grief had a hand on her ribs and refused to let go, her breath catching each time she tried to pull herself together, her whispered, "Please, please," drifting into the empty prairie with no one to answer it, until the soft creak of reins and the weight of a horse slowing on the trail made her lift her head, startled, wiping at her cheeks as though she could hide the evidence of heartache. The man who stepped down from the saddle moved carefully, not intruding, not looming, just standing there with his hat in his hands and a gentleness in his eyes that seemed to dim the hurt for just a moment, his voice low as he spoke the words she'd heard only once before in her life, the kind that didn't demand explanation or strength. Only honesty. "You're crying again," he said quietly, as if it wasn't something to be ashamed of, as if the sky itself cried at dusk and no one thought less of it for doing so. And she tried to answer, tried to straighten, tried to be the composed version of herself she showed the world, but all she managed was a trembling breath before a broken, aching smile curved her lips, the kind born from exhaustion rather than joy, and her voice came small, fragile, asking for something she had never dared ask from anyone since the day her husband died. "Then, hold me until I stop," she whispered, the words barely carrying across the fading light. And the man, broad-shouldered, quiet as winter, steady as the land, took one step closer as though answering a prayer she didn't know she'd spoken, hesitating only long enough to make sure she truly wanted the comfort she sought before opening his arms in silent invitation, the promise of warmth in a world that had taken too much from her. And as she leaned into him, trembling, her tears soaking into his shirt while evening folded around them, the prairie seemed to exhale, as though even the land understood that some hearts break so deeply the only remedy is being held long enough to believe they can mend. She didn't know how long she stayed pressed against him, her forehead resting against the soft wool of his shirt, her breath shuddering each time a new wave of grief rose and fell. But the man, Elias Ward, the quiet carpenter who lived 2 miles beyond the widow's ranch, held her as though the world wasn't rushing around them, as though time had slowed just to let her fall apart without consequence. He didn't speak, didn't offer empty words or try to wipe her tears. He simply anchored himself in the dirt beside her, one arm steady around her back, while the other shielded her from the cold wind that swept across the plains, the warmth of his chest rising and falling like a lullaby her trembling heart clung to. And when her sobs finally quieted into soft, broken breaths, she pulled back just enough to look up at him, her lashes wet, cheeks streaked, the rawness of her sorrow laid bare in a way that would have embarrassed her with any other man. Elias didn't flinch at the sight. If anything, something in his expression gentled even more, a grief of his own flickering in the depths of his eyes. the shared understanding of someone who also knew what loss could carve out of a person. "I'm sorry," she whispered instinctively, wiping her cheeks with shaking hands as if apologizing for a storm she couldn't control. Elias shook his head slowly. "Don't ever apologize for missing someone you loved," he said, his voice deep, rough from years of working wood and speaking little. "That kind of hurt, it means you're still human." His words landed softly inside her, settling in a place that had been hollow for months. She lowered her gaze, twisting the edge of her shawl in her hands. "People in town think I should be better by now," she murmured. "They look at me like grief has an expiration date." Elias crouched slightly, bringing himself level with her eyes. "Town doesn't get a say in how long a heart needs to remember," he answered. "Folks forget that healing ain't measured in months." She inhaled slowly, the air sharp with the scent of sagebrush and cooling earth, her tears drying on her skin, but leaving her chest tender, open, exposed. "Why were you out here?" she asked finally, her voice steadier, but still soft. He glanced toward the riverbank below. "Fixing the fence line for your cattle," he said simply. "Last storm knocked down a post." She frowned, confused. "But I didn't ask you to do that." Elias shrugged one broad shoulder. "Didn't have to." That silence between them warmed, stretching into something new, something that hummed beneath the heartbreak, something she wasn't sure she was ready for but couldn't ignore. She rose slowly from the fallen log, shakiness still in her knees, and Elias stood with her, steadying her before she could wobble. "You shouldn't be alone out here at dusk," he murmured. "Wolves still roam this side of the ridge." "I didn't come to be alone," she said quietly, surprising herself. "I came because I didn't know where else to put the hurt." Elias nodded once, as though he understood that better than anyone. "Then next time," he said, his voice low, careful, nearly tender, "don't come out here to cry. Come find me instead." She met his eyes, steady, warm, painfully sincere, and something inside her, something long frozen, shifted just slightly toward life. I might do that," she whispered. He didn't smile, not fully, but the corner of his mouth softened into something close, something filled with the promise of gentleness. "Good," he murmured, "because I'll always stand still when you break." And as they walked side by side back toward her horse, the last light of dusk brushing the land in muted gold, she realized she wasn't returning home as the same lonely widow who had ridden out. Something had changed on that ridge, something quiet, fragile, and terrifyingly hopeful. The sky had fully darkened by the time she reached her ranch, the horizon fading from deep purple into a quiet black. The kind of night that swallowed sound and left only the soft creak of saddle leather and the rhythmic breath of her mare. She slid off the horse with a heaviness that wasn't exhaustion exactly, more like the echo of emotion still clinging to her ribs, and she half expected the loneliness to settle over her again the moment her boots touched the ground. But when she turned toward the house, heart still raw and unsteady, she froze. A lantern glowed on her front porch, and beside it, arms crossed loosely, hat in one hand, coat draped over the railing, stood Elias Ward. Her breath caught, sharp and surprised, as his gaze lifted to meet hers through the dusk. He didn't straighten in alarm or shift with nerves. He simply watched her with that quiet steadiness he carried like a second skin, his presence filling the empty night in a way that made the house behind him look warmer somehow, lived in instead of hollow. "You came," she whispered, before she could stop herself. Aaliyah stepped down the single porch stair, boots silent in the dirt, lantern light brushing the planes of his face. "Told you not to be alone tonight," he said, his deep voice low enough that she felt it as much as heard it. "Didn't feel right letting you ride home with your heart still shaking." She swallowed hard, fingers curling into her shawl. "You didn't have to wait on me." "Maybe not." He paused, eyes searching hers with a gentleness that undid something inside her. "But I wanted to." The words slipped between them like a warm draft against the cold, and she didn't know where to put her hands or her feelings or the sudden tremor that fluttered in her chest at the sound of those three simple words. Wanted to. Elias glanced toward her mare. "Let me take her," he murmured. "You go inside. I'll be right behind." She nodded and handed him the reins before she could think too hard about it, watching him lead the horse toward the small barn with practiced ease. The silhouette of him, broad shoulders, deliberate steps, the quiet strength in the way he guided the animal, stirred something she hadn't felt in years, something she wasn't sure she deserved to feel again, safety wrapped in the shape of a man. Inside the house, the silence pressed against her, heavier after being held on that hillside. Her hand shook as she lit the lamp on the table, the flame flickering before settling into its glow. She had barely turned when the door opened softly, Elias stepping inside and closing it behind him with a care that made the old wood sigh instead of slam. "Your horse is settled," he said, "and I checked the east fence on my way, tracks of a couple wolves, but they're sticking to the creek bed for now." She blinked at him. "You walked my fence line? Wanted to be sure nothing else was waiting out there to unsettle you." No man had ever said something like that to her, at least not without wanting something in return. But Elias simply shifted his weight, hat still in his hand, as if he wasn't sure whether he should sit or stand or leave or stay. There was a quiet humility in him she hadn't noticed before, a hesitance, as though he'd come here to be strong for her, yet part of him feared he might overstep. She took a small breath. "Elias, why are you being so kind to me?" His jaw tightened, not with frustration, but with a truth he seemed to brace himself before speaking. "Because kindness is the only thing that ever steadied me," he said softly. "And tonight, you looked like you needed someone to steady you for a while." Her throat closed, emotion rising again, too fast, too bare. But before it could spill, Elias reached out with one slow, deliberate motion, his fingertips brushing her elbow, asking permission rather than taking it. "If you start crying again," he murmured, "just tell me to hold you. I will." She stared at him, breath trembling, the warmth of his hand grounding her more than she expected. "And if I don't say anything?" His eyes softened, deep brown, turning almost tender. "Then I'll hold you anyway." Something inside her cracked, not with grief this time, but with relief. And without another word, she stepped forward, closing the space between them with a quiet, aching honesty. His arms wrapped around her instantly, not possessive, not demanding, just solid and sure, the way a harbor waits for a storm-tossed ship. And for the first time in nearly a year, she didn't feel like a widow drowning in her own tears. She felt like a woman being caught, being seen, being saved without being rescued. "Elias," she whispered into his chest, her voice unsteady, "don't go home yet." He lowered his chin, resting it gently against her hair. "I wasn't planning to." And in the soft lamplight of her lonely house, the night shifted around them. not into romance yet, not into anything rushed or fragile, just into two broken hearts that had finally stopped standing alone. The quiet inside the house deepened until she could hear her own breathing against Elias's chest, uneven and catching every few seconds, as if her ribs weren't sure they remembered how to expand without trembling. He held her the whole time, steady, patient, unmoving, his arms wrapped around her like he'd been made for it, like the world outside could collapse and he would still be there, unshaken. She hadn't been touched gently in so long that the sensation alone nearly unraveled her. His hand slid slowly up her back, fingers tracing the fabric of her blouse with a caution that felt reverent, not hesitant. "You're shaking," he murmured into her hair. "I'm right here." That simple sentence cracked open a dam she'd been bracing for months. Tears rose fast, sudden, sharp, and she tried to pull away with a shaky breath. I'm sorry," she stammered, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand, as if embarrassed to feel it all. "I don't know why I'm—" Elias caught her wrist gently, lowering her hand from her face. "Don't apologize for crying," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "People only apologize for crying when someone taught them crying was wrong." Her breath broke, completely broke, and she let herself fold into him again, tears spilling freely this time. Not the controlled ones she'd swallowed after funerals, not the quiet ones she'd hidden at night. These were raw, unfiltered, honest. Elias held her through every one of them. No flinching, no impatience, no tightening of his arms as if trying to fix what he didn't understand. He simply became a place, a warm, steady, living place, for her grief to finally land. After a long stretch of silence, she found her voice, thick and trembling. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be now. Everyone keeps saying I'm strong, but Her words dissolved, swallowed by a fresh wave of emotion. Elias breathed out slowly, his thumb brushing carefully across her shoulder blade. "Strength doesn't mean you don't fall apart," he said. "It just means you don't stay broken once you do." She closed her eyes, pressing her forehead to his chest, letting the warmth of him seep into her bones. Her husband had been gone a year. The loneliness had been eating her from the inside out. And here, in the middle of her quiet house with its ghost-filled corners, Elias's heartbeat felt like a lifeline. She felt him shift slightly, not pulling away, just adjusting so he could see her face. His hand lifted, cupping her cheek with a tenderness she wasn't prepared for. "Look at me," he said softly. She tried. Slowly, her eyes rose to meet his. They weren't inches apart. They were breaths apart. Close enough for her to smell the faint cedar on his skin. Close enough to see the flicker of worry and something else. Something deeper, caught in the dark of his gaze. "You don't have to figure out who you are tonight," he whispered. "You just have to not do it alone." Her lip trembled again, but this time the tears didn't fall. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, wiping the last wet streak with a touch that felt like a promise. "Elias," she whispered, voice barely steady. "Why me? I mean, why are you doing this for me?" His answer was slow, honest, carved from the deepest part of him. "Because you've been trying to carry a whole world by yourself," he said. "And I've spent a long time wishing you'd let someone help." The confession struck something inside her so tender she nearly stepped away just to breathe. But his arms softened around her, not pulling her closer, not trapping, just holding gently enough that she knew she had the choice. She didn't step away. She let herself lean into him again, a little differently this time, not collapsing, not clinging, just letting her heart rest. Elias exhaled, the kind of breath a man releases only when a weight he's been carrying quietly finally shifts. "Let me stay a while," he murmured. "Just sit with you, nothing more." She nodded, unable to trust her voice. He didn't move until she did, guiding her slowly toward the sofa, his hand never leaving hers. And when they sat, her curled at one end, him close beside her but not crowding, he draped a blanket softly across her legs, his fingers brushing her knee just long enough to let her know he was still there, still steady, still willing to be the place where her trembling could settle. Outside, the wind moved softly through the grass. Inside, the widow who had cried alone for a year finally cried in the presence of someone who didn't look away. And the mountain man who had watched her break from a distance finally sat close enough to help her gather the pieces, not by force, but by staying, by listening, by not leaving. "You're crying again," he whispered once more, when her breath caught. She managed a fragile smile. "Then hold me until I stop." And he did. Dawn crept into the house gently, as if afraid to disturb the quiet that had settled over them in the night. Soft gold light spilled across the wooden floorboards, tracing the outline of the sofa where she and Elias had finally drifted into a fragile, tangled sleep, her curled against his side, his arm wrapped around her with unconscious protectiveness, their breaths slowly finding the same rhythm. She woke first. Not abruptly, not with the jolt she'd grown used to since widowhood, but with a slow, warm awareness that something was different. She blinked, lifting her head just enough to see Elias's face in the morning light. He looked younger when he slept, less burdened, less guarded. The beard she'd always thought made him look a little wild seemed softer now. He wasn't what anyone would call a gentle-looking man. But lying there, he looked like someone who had spent the entire night listening to grief instead of running from it, like a man who didn't leave. Her chest tightened at the thought. She hadn't realized until this moment how much she'd braced for him to disappear before dawn. Everyone did, eventually. Friends, family, neighbors who meant well, but stayed only until the casseroles ran out. But not Elias. He hadn't left when she broke down. He hadn't left when her sorrow became too much to hide. He hadn't left when she'd asked him to hold her through the worst of it. He was still here. And that simple fact shook her more than last night's tears. She shifted slightly, and his arm instinctively tightened around her waist, pulling her closer as if he'd done it 1,000 times. "You awake?" he murmured, voice thick with sleep. She froze, not out of fear, but because something warm fluttered deep inside her. "A little," she whispered. "You?" "I am now," he said, opening his eyes. They were softer than she'd ever seen them, warm brown with flecks of gold catching the sunrise. He studied her for a long moment, not speaking, just looking, like he was memorizing something he had no right to memorize. Embarrassment prickled at her cheeks, and she started to sit up, but Elias gently stopped her with a light touch to her arm. "You don't have to run away," he whispered. His tone wasn't pleading, it was steady, certain. "I'm not running," she said quietly. I'm not used to waking up like this." "With someone beside you?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "With someone who stays." He exhaled. The kind of slow breath a man releases when he realizes something fragile is being offered back to him. I stay, he said simply, if you'll have me. The words landed between them with a weight she wasn't ready for, and yet not unwelcome. Her fingers twisted in the blanket instinctively. Elias, last night I wasn't myself. I cried more than I have in months, and I don't want you thinking I'm broken, he finished gently. She looked down. A burden. Elias reached out, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. He touched her chin, lifting it just enough for her to meet his eyes. You could never be a burden, he said. Not to me. The way he said it, steady, quiet, without hesitation, made her breath catch. No one had spoken to her like that since her husband died. No one had offered steadiness without expecting strength in return. She swallowed hard, blinking against the sudden sting behind her eyes. Elias, I don't know how to do this. Do what? Let someone close again, he nodded, understanding settling across his face like a soft shadow. Then we take it slow, he said. As slow as you need. I'm not asking for anything more than what you're willing to give. Her heart twisted. He meant it. Every word. She felt seen, truly seen, in a way she hadn't since before the world broke. She let out a shaky breath. You shouldn't be this kind to me. Elias's smile was small, almost sad. Kindness isn't a choice with you, he said. It's the only way I know how to be around someone He stopped himself. The silence stretched, warm and trembling with possibility. Someone you what? She asked softly. He looked at her, the truth flickering in his eyes before he spoke. Someone I care for. Her heart stumbled in her chest. She should pull away. She should protect herself. She should remember how easily love can be torn from a woman's hands. But instead, she found herself leaning closer, drawn to the quiet certainty in his voice. Elias, his breath brushed her lips, but he didn't close the distance. He didn't assume. He waited, always waited, for her. She lifted her hand, resting her fingertips lightly against his jaw. It was the smallest gesture, but in the quiet dawn, it felt as monumental as a vow. His eyes softened. Does this mean? It means, she whispered, voice trembling, that I don't want you to leave, not now. Relief washed over his features in a slow, aching wave. Then I won't. They sat there in the early morning light. Two people who had lost more than most, holding on to something fragile and new. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of it. The first breath after too long underwater. The first warmth after too long alone. And as Elias brushed a thumb across her cheek again, she didn't look away. She let herself feel it. She let herself breathe. And for the first time since the funeral, the widow realized she wasn't living in her sorrow anymore. She was living in the possibility of something after, something steadier, something warm, something like him. By late afternoon, the wind had settled, leaving the town wrapped in a soft, amber stillness as the sun drifted lower behind the ridge. The widow walked beside Elias down the main street, the wooden boards warm beneath their steps as they passed the mercantile, the smithy, the faded blue church whose bell tower leaned just slightly to the east. She hadn't walked into town with another man since her husband's death, and though Elias kept a respectful distance, his hands loose at his sides, his stride slow to match hers, she could feel the weight of curious eyes drifting toward them from porches and open doorways. People didn't whisper loudly, but they whispered enough. It wasn't malice. Not exactly, just small-town habit, the way folks tried to assemble pieces of a story before they knew the whole truth. She tugged her shawl tighter around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt. Elias noticed instantly. "If this is too much," he murmured, pitching his voice low enough for only her to hear. "We can turn around," she shook her head. "No, I won't hide in that house forever." "You never had to hide," he replied. "Grief isn't shameful." His tone was so matter-of-fact, so free of judgment, that she exhaled a quiet, unsteady laugh. "You make everything sound simple." "Not simple," he said. "Just honest." His honesty had a strange way of loosening knots inside her she hadn't known were there. They kept walking. And then, just as they passed the sheriff's office, a familiar voice called out. "Ma'am." Sheriff Colton stepped down from the boardwalk, removing his hat with a respectful nod. He was younger than Elias, with sandy hair and a square jaw sharpened by long nights and hard choices. But today, his face held something gentler, concern, maybe even relief. "We hadn't seen you in a spell," he said. "Folks were starting to worry." She forced a polite smile. "I'm all right, Sheriff." "Good," he said carefully. "Good. And you, Elias?" Elias tipped his head. "Sheriff." The sheriff's gaze flicked between them, just once, just enough to say he noticed. But then he stepped aside, giving them room to pass without further questions. She exhaled only after they reached the far end of the street, where the sound of a lone harmonica drifted from the saloon's open windows. Elias glanced sideways at her. "You did well." "It was only a walk," she said. "Maybe to you," he replied gently. "But for you, it's the first time you've let people see you again." "Really see you?" She hesitated. "And what do they see?" Elias slowed his steps, turning just enough so his shoulder brushed hers. A tiny touch, accidental or maybe not, but one that sent a warm ripple through her chest. "They see a woman who survived grief that would have broken most," he said. "A woman who's finding her way back." His voice lowered. "A woman who isn't alone." Her breath trembled, not from sadness this time, but from something dangerously close to hope. They continued walking until they reached the quiet stretch behind the livery, where the prairie opened again, and the golden light fell across Elias's features in a way that made him look carved from something timeless. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. He nodded. "Last night, when I cried the way I did it change anything for you?" "Yes," he said, after a heartbeat. Her stomach tightened. "How?" "It made me want to protect you even more." His voice wasn't dramatic. It wasn't romantic in the way novels painted romance. It was steady and true, as if spoken by a man who didn't know how to lie, not with his words, not with his heart. "Elias," she wasn't sure what she meant to say. "Thank you, I'm afraid. Don't go. Stay closer. Stay forever." They were all tangled together, impossible to separate. He stepped closer by an inch, only an inch, but she felt it like a promise. "If you ever cry again," he murmured, "you won't cry alone, not while I'm here." Her throat tightened. "But what if one day you're not?" "I will be." She closed her eyes, absorbing the softness of those words, the certainty behind them. When she opened them again, the prairie was glowing copper, the sky streaked with violet and gold. Elias held her gaze with a tenderness that reached into the hollows grief had carved in her. "The town will talk," she said. "Let them," he replied. "They've talked about me for years. Won't hurt to give them something true to talk about for once." She laughed, a small, startled laugh that felt like it had been trapped inside her for months. Elias's expression softened even more at the sound. There it is, he murmured. What? Your first real laugh I've ever heard. She shook her head, but her smile remained. You're impossible. I know, he said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek with the lightest touch imaginable. But you're smiling anyway. And she was, really smiling, for the first time since everything fell apart. As evening deepened and the first stars began to show, Elias offered his hand, not demanding, not assuming, just offering. She hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his, letting their fingers lace together. Warmth flooded through her. And as they walked back toward town, toward whatever came next, she realized something quietly, astonishingly true. This wasn't the story of a widow clinging to a memory. This was the story of a woman learning, slowly and bravely, to let herself be held by someone who chose her in the dark and in the light. Someone who wasn't going anywhere. Someone who stayed. The wind softened as they reached the edge of the widow's yard, and she stopped so suddenly that Elias nearly walked into her, but she wasn't startled. She was trembling, holding herself the way someone does when every emotion has been corked for too long and the bottle finally cracks. She pressed her palms to her eyes, shaking her head as if ashamed to be seen like this, whispering, I'm crying again. I don't know why I can't stop. And Elias stepped close, but did not touch her yet, letting his voice reach her gently. You don't have to stop. And that alone made her breath catch because no one had ever told her her sadness wasn't a burden. And when she lowered her hands, tears streaking down her cheeks, he finally cupped her face with both hands, warm and steady. His thumb brushing the corner of her eye, as if memorizing the path of every tear. She tried to apologize, choking out, I don't mean to fall apart every time you're near. But he shook his head and whispered, maybe you're not falling apart. Maybe you're letting go. And those words undid her completely, a quiet sob escaping as she leaned forward, her forehead resting against his chest, her fists curling lightly into his shirt, like she needed something solid to keep her from drifting away with the grief. Elias wrapped his arms around her, not tight, just sure, just certain, lifting a weight off her that she didn't know she'd been carrying since the night she became a widow. And she clung to him with a desperation that wasn't fear, but relief, whispering shakily, I'm so tired of being strong alone. And he lowered his head enough that his breath warmed her hair as he murmured, then don't be alone anymore. And for a long, quiet moment, the world around them vanished. The barn, the fading evening, the ache that had chased her for months. And all that existed was the steadiness of his heartbeat and the way her breathing slowly matched his, softer, calmer, as if his arms were the only place her sorrow finally loosened. When she lifted her face again, eyes shining and red, she didn't step back. She stayed right there, close enough that he could feel the trembling in her breath, and she whispered, Elias, don't let go yet. And he answered without hesitation, I won't, holding her as though this moment wasn't breaking her, but rebuilding her, piece by fragile piece, in the quiet safety of his hands. The dusk settled slow over the valley as Elias guided her toward the porch, not leading her, not pulling her, simply walking beside her with the quiet steadiness of a man who understood that healing was something you matched your steps to. The widow wiped at her eyes but didn't push him away this time, her breath still unsteady, as if her ribs were trying to remember how to move without breaking. And when they reached the steps, she sank down onto the top one, letting her hands fall uselessly into her lap while the last of the tears tracked down her cheeks in silent streaks, and Elias lowered himself beside her, not too close at first, giving her the space to breathe, until she leaned ever so slightly toward him, a small gesture that felt like a door gently unlocking inside her, and he shifted an inch closer so that their shoulders touched. A soft, warm contact that grounded her more than any words could. She stared at the horizon, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't cry like this with anyone else." And Elias, watching her carefully, said, "Maybe that's because you don't feel safe with anyone else." And she closed her eyes at that truth, a shaky exhale slipping from her chest as she whispered, "I haven't felt safe in so long I forgot what it meant." And before the shame could rise in her throat, he reached over slowly, deliberately, giving her every chance to pull away, and laid his arm around her shoulders, and she surprised herself by leaning fully into him, letting her head rest beneath his jaw, feeling the deep rumble of his breath steadying her as though her heartbeat had been waiting to borrow his rhythm. The night birds stirred in the fields, the faint smell of hay lifting on the breeze, and she felt something she hadn't known she was searching for, a quiet place inside herself that didn't tremble under the weight of old grief. She whispered, "Elias, please hold me a little longer," not as a plea born of desperation, but as a truth finally spoken aloud, and he answered without pause, tightening his arm around her just enough that she felt chosen, not pitied, murmuring, "As long as you need," and she let her tears fall again, softer this time, as if each one carried away a piece of the loneliness she'd worn like a second skin. The porch around them turning into the first place in years where she could breathe without bracing for the next hurt. She stayed in his arms until the stars began to glow, neither of them speaking, because the silence itself had become a kind of promise, one she wasn't ready to name yet, but one she finally believed she deserved. The lantern flickered low in the kitchen as the widow stepped inside, Elias following a slow step behind her, as if he feared one wrong movement might break the fragile peace she had finally allowed herself, and she busied her hands with the kettle, though neither of them wanted tea. The small motion simply a shield she had used for years to hide the tremble in her fingers. But Elias saw it anyway and didn't call attention to it, choosing instead to lean against the doorway with that quiet patience she was beginning to trust. She set the kettle down with a soft clink, her breath catching as she said, "I wasn't always like this," and he straightened without interrupting, letting her speak in her own time, her voice shaking as she continued. "I used to laugh. I used to talk without weighing every word. I used to sleep through the night." And when her throat tightened, she gripped the edge of the counter too hard, and Elias crossed the room not quickly, but with steady purpose, placing his hand over hers gently, giving her warmth before giving her questions. And she swallowed hard, whispering, "He made me feel small even when I did everything right," the confession spilling from her with so much buried hurt that Elias's jaw tightened. Though he didn't let anger take the room from her, he simply said, "You're not small," the words landing with a weight she wasn't prepared for, her eyes filling again as she met his gaze, seeing not pity, but recognition, as though he had been waiting years to tell someone that truth and meant it more deeply than she'd ever been believed before. She pulled her hand back, not in rejection, but in fear that if he held on, she might fall apart completely. But Elias stepped closer and spoke in that low, steady voice. "Tell me what you're afraid of." And the widow looked at the floor because the truth felt too heavy to give shape to, yet it rose anyway. "I'm afraid if someone is kind to me, I won't know how to be anything but grateful, and grateful women get hurt." And Elias shook his head, slow and deliberate, saying, "Kindness isn't a debt, and you don't owe me anything for being gentle." And those words broke something open inside her, because she had never known a man who offered comfort without expecting ownership in return, her breath shuddering as she whispered, "Why are you doing this for me?" And he answered simply, "Because you deserve to be seen whole." And she closed her eyes against the ache of being understood that deeply, feeling the old armor inside her loosen piece by piece. And when she opened her eyes again, she let him stand close enough that their breaths mixed in the warm air of the quiet kitchen. Her voice barely audible as she said, "I don't know how to let someone stay." And he replied, "Then I'll stay slow." And the kettle began to whine softly on the stove, the sound small but steady, just like the beginning of something she wasn't afraid of anymore. The widow stood on the porch just before dawn, wrapped in her shawl as the horizon softened from blue to pale gold. And for the first time in years, she felt no urge to rehearse her breathing or brace for footsteps behind her. Only the quiet awareness that someone was awake inside the house who would not raise his voice, would not blame her for the weather or the day or her tears. A thought so unfamiliar that it made her chest tighten as if her own ribs didn't trust peace yet. She heard the door shift and Elias stepped out quietly, not touching her, not assuming anything, just letting the cold morning settle around them as he asked in that steady voice, "Did you sleep at all?" And she nodded, though it hadn't been a full night, only enough that her mind didn't hurt from the effort of staying alert, enough that she dreamed without fear, enough that her heartbeat hadn't woken her. She said softly, "I kept waiting for something to go wrong, and Elias didn't promise perfection, didn't say life wouldn't bruise her again. He simply replied, 'When it does, you won't face it alone.' And that simple truth made her grip the porch railing, because her body didn't know where to put an emotion that didn't come from fear. He stepped a little closer, slow enough for her to move if she needed distance, but she didn't, and she watched his breath cloud in the cold air as he asked, "Can I hold you?" And the question reached deeper than his arms ever could, because no man had ever asked, not once. Not in all her years of being claimed and commanded and corrected, and something fragile inside her steadied as she nodded. Barely, but enough. Elias wrapped his arms around her carefully, as if she were something he wanted to keep safe but never own, and the widow let herself lean into him, her cheek against his chest, listening to the quiet strength in his heartbeat, the warmth of him grounding her in a way she had never imagined possible. The porch, the fields, the distant cattle, the faint wind, all of it blurred into stillness as she whispered, "I'm afraid I'll fall apart." And Elias rested his chin lightly on her hair, answering, "Then fall here." And the words opened a door she had never dared approach, a door into a life where her softness wasn't a flaw or a liability, where her tears weren't an inconvenience, but a language someone finally understood. She didn't sob, didn't break, didn't collapse. She simply breathed deeply, steadily into a space where her body wasn't bracing for harm. And the relief was so immense it felt like its own kind of trembling. She murmured, "I don't know how to be loved without apologizing for it." And Elias held her a little tighter and said, "Then we'll unlearn that together." And something in her, long shuttered and long silent, eased for the first time in years. When the sun finally crested the ridge, warming the earth in slow golden strokes, she pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes still wet but no longer afraid, and she managed a small, tired smile as she said, "Hold me until I stop," and Elias answered without hesitation, "As long as it takes." And in that quiet morning light, with no promises beyond honesty and time, she let herself rest in his arms, not as someone healing, not as someone hurting, but as a woman who had finally found a place where she didn't have to be anything but herself. Sometimes healing isn't loud. It's the quiet moment when someone finally holds you without asking why. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And join us again for another tale where the West remembers those who refuse to give up on love.